Wahrheit für richtig hältst, ob du glaubst, dass ich fleißig gewesen bin, dass ich gearbeitet habe, dass ich mich in diesen Jahren für dich eingesetzt habe.
A single penguin, not huddled among thousands of its brethren against the Antarctic wind, but alone, waddling deliberately away from the only home it has ever known. Its flippers brush against ice that has never known the warmth of the colony's collective body heat. Each step takes it further from the rhythmic cacophony of penguin calls, deeper into a silence so profound it seems to have texture. This is not a nature documentary. This is a philosophical meditation. The French existentialist Albert Camus once wrote about Sisyphus, condemned to roll a boulder up a mountain for eternity. But what if we inverted this image? What if the mountain itself became the object of desire, not punishment? What if our protagonist chose the mountain, chose the solitude, chose the wandering? Today we explore the philosophy of the solitary penguin, a creature who, against every biological imperative, every evolutionary programming, turns its back on the colony and walks into the vastness. This penguin is not lost. This penguin is seeking. In this journey, we'll traverse the great questions of philosophy. What does it mean to exist? What is freedom? What is the nature of the self when stripped of social mirrors? What is authentic being? And perhaps most urgently, what do we become when we leave the warmth of belonging and step into the cold clarity of solitude? The penguin is our guide. The mountain is our question. And the stage of life awaits its most unlikely performer. Ontology, the nature of being. Let us begin with the most fundamental question in all of philosophy. What does it mean to be? Martin Heidegger, the German phenomenologist, distinguished between beings and being itself, between the ontic and the ontological. A penguin in the colony exists as a being among beings, defined by its function. It huddles, it breeds, it fishes, it survives. Its being is absorbed into the collective being of the colony. It is a penguin doing penguin things. But our wandering penguin has stepped outside this framework. In leaving the colony, it has created what Heidegger might call an ontological rupture, a break in the continuous flow of unreflective existence. Suddenly, the penguin is not merely existing, but confronting its existence. Consider the moment of departure. The penguin stands at the edge of the colony, the invisible boundary between the known and the unknown. Behind it, the dense, warm press of bodies, the familiar smells, the predetermined patterns of behavior that have governed penguin life for millions of years. Ahead, the mountain, indifferent and vast. In this moment, the penguin experiences what Jean-Paul Sartre called existence preceding essence. The colony represents essence, the pre-given nature of what a penguin is supposed to be. But in choosing to leave, in this act of radical freedom, the penguin creates its existence first. It becomes before it knows what it will become. This is the fundamental condition of authentic being. We are not born with a predetermined essence that we must fulfill. We are thrown into existence and must create meaning through our choices. The penguin, in its wandering, embodies this truth more purely than perhaps any human ever could. But there's something deeper here. The penguin's being is revealed most clearly in its relationship to absence. The absence of the colony. The absence of predetermined purpose. The absence of the comfort of conformity. As Heidegger wrote, the nothing-nothings, which is to say, absence itself is an active force that shapes our being. The mountain, too, participates in this ontological drama. It is not merely a geographical feature, but a manifestation of what Sartre called being in itself. Massive, indifferent, complete unto itself. The mountain does not need the penguin. It does not acknowledge the penguin. It simply is. And in confronting this pure being in itself, the penguin confronts the nature of its own being for itself, its consciousness, its freedom, its terrible and beautiful responsibility to define itself. The penguin waddles up slopes of ice and stone, and with each step, it enacts a metaphysical statement. I am not what you say I am. I am not the sum of my biological programming. I am this movement, this choice, this journey. I am the being who questions being. In the colony, existence was automatic. On the mountain, every moment is an assertion of being against the void. Epistemology, the nature of knowledge. Now we must ask, what does the penguin know? And how does it know? René Descartes sought certainty in the famous declaration, I think, therefore I am. But what of our penguin? Does it think in the way Descartes meant? Perhaps not, but it perceives, it navigates, it chooses. And in doing so, it engages in a more primal form of epistemology, knowledge not as abstract cognition, but as embodied experience. The phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty argued that all knowledge begins with the body. We don't think ourselves into understanding the world, we live ourselves into it. The penguin knows the ice not through scientific analysis, but through the pressure of its feet, the slip and catch of movement, the bite of wind against its feathers. This is what Merleau-Ponty called being in the world. Knowledge as intimate participation rather than distant observation. Consider what the penguin learns in solitude that it could never learn in colony. In the dense pack of bodies, knowledge is social, imitative, passed down through behavioral patterns. A young penguin learns by watching, by following, by conforming. But our wandering penguin has no one to imitate. It must encounter the world directly, without the mediating filter of collective wisdom. This is what the philosopher Edmund Husserl called phenomenological reduction, the bracketing of all assumptions to encounter phenomena as they truly appear to consciousness. The penguin has performed the ultimate phenomenological reduction by leaving behind all the accumulated assumptions of penguin culture. It sees the mountain not as penguins traditionally see mountains, but as this specific being in this specific moment encounters this specific landscape. But here we encounter a paradox central to epistemology, the problem of solipsism. How can the penguin know that its experience of the mountain is real and not merely a projection of its own consciousness? How can it know that the world exists independently of its perception? The philosopher George Berkeley argued that to be is to be perceived, that existence itself depends on consciousness. By this logic, the mountain exists for the penguin only insofar as the penguin perceives it. When the penguin sleeps, does the mountain vanish? Our penguin, I would argue, resolves this paradox not through logic, but through action. Each time it stumbles on a hidden crevasse, each time the wind pushes against it with unexpected force, the world announces its stubborn independence from the penguin's will. This is knowledge of the most certain kind, the knowledge that comes from resistance, from the world's refusal to conform to our wishes. Immanuel Kant distinguished between phenomena, things as we experience them, and noumena, things as they are in themselves. The penguin can never know the mountain as it truly is, only as it appears through the lens of penguin perception. But in solitude, paradoxically, the penguin may come closer to this truth than it ever could in the colony. For in the colony, the mountain is filtered through layers of social construction, collective myth, inherited fear. The solitary penguin encounters something closer to the raw phenomenon itself. And what of error? In the colony, the group corrects individual mistakes through social learning, but the wandering penguin has no such safety net. A misjudgment could be fatal. Yet this vulnerability to error is inseparable from the possibility of genuine discovery. To know truly, we must risk being wrong. The penguin climbs higher and its knowledge expands, not in the sense of accumulating facts, but in the deeper sense of understanding its own position in the cosmic order. It learns the limits of its body, the vastness of the world, the irrelevance of its own concerns to the indifferent stone and ice. This, too, is knowledge. Perhaps the most important knowledge of all. Ethics, the question of ought. But now we must confront the moral dimension of the penguin's journey. Has the penguin done wrong in leaving the colony? Does it have obligations to its community that it has selfishly abandoned? The utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham might argue that the penguin's departure reduces the overall happiness of the colony. One less body to share warmth, one less partner for breeding, one less member to contribute to collective survival. By this calculus, the penguin has acted immorally. But Immanuel Kant would counter that the penguin's action must be judged not by its consequences, but by the nature of the act itself. Kant's categorical imperative demands that we act only according to maxims we could will to become universal law. Could the penguin will that all penguins should leave the colony? No, that would mean the end of penguin society entirely. Therefore, Kant might conclude the penguin has acted wrongly. Yet I would argue that both these ethical frameworks miss something essential about the penguin's situation. They assume that the penguin's primary moral obligation is to the collective. But what of the penguin's obligation to itself? What of authenticity as a moral imperative? Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, spoke of the teleological suspension of the ethical, the idea that in rare moments of existential crisis, the individual must transcend conventional morality to achieve authentic selfhood. He illustrated this with the biblical story of Abraham, commanded by God to sacrifice his son Isaac. Abraham's obedience to the divine voice required him to violate the ethical law against murder. Our penguin, too, performs a kind of teleological suspension. It violates the ethical norms of penguin society, the unspoken rules of staying together, of contributing to collective survival, of playing one's assigned role, in service of something higher, the call to authentic existence. Friedrich Nietzsche would recognize in the wandering penguin his concept of the Übermensch, the individual who creates their own values rather than accepting inherited ones. The colony represents slave morality, the morality of the herd, where safety and conformity are the highest goods. The penguin on the mountain embodies master morality, the courage to define good and evil for oneself. But we must be careful here. Nietzsche's philosophy can slide into solipsistic amorality if taken to extremes. Does the penguin owe nothing to others? Is all obligation simply a chain to be thrown off? Perhaps a middle path exists in the ethics of care, as articulated by feminist philosophers like Nell Noddings. This framework suggests that ethical obligation arises from relationships and embodied connections rather than abstract principles. The penguin may have left the physical colony, but has it truly severed all relationships? Does it carry the colony within itself in the form of learned behaviors, memories, perhaps even guilt or longing? The penguin faces a different kind of ethical question on the mountain. Without the mediating presence of society, its actions have no moral witness. If it encounters another creature struggling in the snow, does it have an obligation to help when there's no one to praise its virtue or condemn its indifference? This is ethics in the purest sense, not performed for social approval, but enacted in the stark privacy of moral isolation. Emmanuel Levinas argued that ethics begins in the face of the other, in the recognition of another being's vulnerability and need. But what happens when there is no other, when the penguin faces only stone and ice and sky? Does ethics evaporate in the absence of social relationships? I would argue instead that the mountain becomes the other, not in a mystical sense, but in the sense that the penguin must respond to the mountain's demands, must respect its power, must learn to coexist with forces far greater than itself. This is a kind of environmental ethics, a recognition that our moral obligations extend beyond our species, beyond even sentient beings, to the world itself. The penguin's wandering, then, is not an escape from ethics, but an entry into a more primordial ethical space. One where the question is not, what do others expect of me, but how should I be in this world? And perhaps this is the deepest moral truth the penguin teaches us, that sometimes the most ethical act is the one that appears most selfish, the preservation of one's authentic self against the crushing weight of collective expectation. Metaphysics, the ultimate questions. Finally, we arrive at metaphysics, the investigation of ultimate reality, of what lies beneath and beyond the surface of appearances. What is the penguin really, not biologically, but metaphysically? Is it a discrete, bounded self, or is it a node in a vast network of relationships? Is it a substance that persists through time, or a process of continuous becoming? The ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus declared that you cannot step in the same river twice, for it is not the same river and you are not the same person. The penguin that left the colony is not the same penguin that stands on the mountain now. Every moment of journey has transformed it. The penguin is not a thing, but an event, a continual unfolding, and yet something persists. The penguin carries memory, continuity, a sense of identity that bridges past and present. This is what philosophers call the problem of personal identity. What makes the penguin the same individual across time, despite constant change? John Locke argued that identity consists in continuity of consciousness, the thread of memory that connects one moment to the next. The penguin is the same individual because it remembers leaving the colony, remembers the early stages of the climb, experiences its life as a continuous narrative. But the Buddhist tradition offers a radically different metaphysics. It denies the existence of a permanent self altogether. What we call the self is actually a convenient fiction, a label we apply to a constantly shifting aggregation of physical and mental processes. The penguin, in this view, is not a thing that makes a journey, but a journey that creates the temporary illusion of thingness. On the mountain, stripped of social roles and collective identity, the penguin may actually come closer to experiencing this truth. In the colony, its identity was reinforced constantly through social interaction. It was that penguin, recognized by others, defined by its place in the social hierarchy. On the mountain, no one names it, no one recognizes it, no one confirms its existence. Does the self evaporate in the absence of witnesses? Or does the opposite occur? Does the penguin discover a more authentic selfhood, one not dependent on external validation? This leads us to questions of consciousness itself. Thomas Nagel famously asked, "What is it like to be a bat?" The question points to the irreducible subjectivity of conscious experience. There is something it is like to be a penguin climbing a mountain, an interior dimension of experience that can never be fully captured in objective description. The penguin's consciousness is not like human consciousness. It doesn't philosophize, doesn't construct elaborate conceptual frameworks, but it experiences. It feels the cold, the exhaustion, perhaps something we might recognize as determination or curiosity, or even joy. This raw experiencing is the ground of all metaphysics, the fundamental fact of existence from which all other questions flow. But what of the big questions? What of God, free will, the nature of time and space? Baruch Spinoza conceived of God not as a supernatural being, but as the totality of nature itself. Deus sive natura, God or nature. By this metaphysics, the penguin is not separate from the divine, but a manifestation of it. The mountain, the ice, the penguin struggle, all are modes of the one infinite substance expressing itself in myriad forms. From this perspective, the penguin's journey is not an individual choosing its path, but the universe becoming conscious of itself through the medium of penguin experience. The wandering is not rebellion, but cosmic necessity, the working out of natural laws that include both the gregarious instinct and the rare impulse to solitude. And what of free will? Did the penguin choose to leave, or was it compelled by forces beyond its control? Genetic variation, neurological quirks, environmental triggers. The hard determinist would say the penguin's departure was as inevitable as a rock rolling down a hill, simply the playing out of prior causes. But the compatibilist would argue that freedom and determinism can coexist. The penguin is free if it acts according to its own nature, even if that nature was itself determined. The penguin wanted to leave and could have stayed if it wanted otherwise. That's freedom enough. Climbing higher into thinner air, into a landscape even more austere, the penguin enacts metaphysical truths that philosophers have debated for millennia. It demonstrates that existence is stranger and more profound than our comfortable assumptions allow. It shows us that the deepest questions cannot be answered from the safety of the colony, but must be lived, must be embodied, must be risked. And so we return to where we began, the penguin as performer on the stage of life. Shakespeare wrote that all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. But our penguin has chosen a different theater entirely. It has left the crowded stage of the colony with its well-rehearsed performances and familiar scripts and ventured onto a stage of cosmic proportions. Here on the mountain, there is no audience except the indifferent universe. There are no critics to applaud or condemn. There is no script to follow, no director to provide guidance. The penguin improvises existence itself. This is what the theater of the absurd, as conceived by Albert Camus and dramatized by Samuel Beckett, understood so profoundly. We are performers in a play with no inherent meaning, no predetermined purpose. And yet we perform. The penguin continues to climb even when there is no rational reason to do so, even when the summit may mean death. Camus wrote that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. We must imagine that the eternal labor, the endless rolling of the boulder, becomes meaningful through the act of conscious acceptance. The penguin, too, transforms absurdity into meaning through the simple fact of continuing. But I think the penguin's performance offers something more than Camus' heroic acceptance of absurdity. The penguin has discovered what Nietzsche called amor fati, the love of one's fate. Not mere acceptance, but active embrace. The mountain is not a punishment, but a gift. The solitude is not loneliness, but freedom. The risk is not foolishness, but courage. Every philosopher we've encountered on this journey, from Heidegger's concern with authentic being, to Sartre's emphasis on radical freedom, from Kant's categorical imperatives, to Nietzsche's will to power, from Buddhist no self to Spinoza's pantheism, every philosophical tradition finds its embodiment in the solitary wanderer. And so we return to where we began, the penguin as performer on the stage of life. Shakespeare wrote that all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. But our penguin has chosen a different theater entirely. It has left the crowded stage of the colony with its well-rehearsed performances and familiar scripts and ventured onto a stage of cosmic proportions. Here on the mountain, there is no audience except the indifferent universe. There are no critics to applaud or condemn. There is no script to follow, no director to provide guidance. The penguin improvises existence itself. This is what the theater of the absurd, as conceived by Albert Camus and dramatized by Samuel Beckett, understood so profoundly. We are performers in a play with no inherent meaning, no predetermined purpose. And yet we perform. The penguin continues to climb even when there is no rational reason to do so, even when the summit may mean death. Camus wrote that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. We must imagine that the eternal labor, the endless rolling of the boulder, becomes meaningful through the act of conscious acceptance. The penguin, too, transforms absurdity into meaning through the simple fact of continuing. But I think the penguin's performance offers something more than Camus' heroic acceptance of absurdity. The penguin has discovered what Nietzsche called amor fati, the love of one's fate. Not mere acceptance, but active embrace. The mountain is not a punishment, but a gift. The solitude is not loneliness, but freedom. The risk is not foolishness, but courage. Every philosopher we've encountered on this journey, from Heidegger's concern with authentic being, to Sartre's emphasis on radical freedom, from Kant's categorical imperatives to Nietzsche's will to power, from Buddhist no self to Spinoza's pantheism, every philosophical tradition finds its embodiment in this solitary wanderer. The penguin teaches us that philosophy is not an academic exercise conducted in comfortable libraries, but a lived practice enacted in the flesh. Understanding existence requires more than reading about it. It requires the courage to step away from the warmth of collective certainty and into the cold clarity of solitary questioning. What happens to the penguin in the end? Does it reach the summit? Does it perish in the attempt? Does it turn back, wiser for the journey, to rejoin the colony? We cannot know, and perhaps that uncertainty is the point. The meaning of the journey is not in its destination, but in the journeying itself. Every step is complete. Every moment of choice is an achievement. The penguin creates meaning with each waddle across the ice, each pause to rest, each continuation despite exhaustion. We live in a time that fears solitude, that fills every moment with noise and distraction, that measures worth by social metrics and collective approval. The wandering penguin offers a different model of existence, one where value comes not from fitting in, but from the courage to stand apart, not from achieving preset goals, but from the authentic pursuit of self-chosen paths. The mountain does not care about the penguin. The universe does not acknowledge its struggle, and yet the struggle itself is holy. The wandering itself is sacred. In choosing to climb, in leaving safety for uncertainty, the penguin performs the fundamental act of faith that undergirds all philosophy, the faith that the examined life, the chosen life, the authentic life is worth living, even when it offers no guarantees. As we conclude this meditation, I invite you to see yourself in the penguin. You too have felt the pull to leave the colony, to question the assumptions you've inherited, to risk the comfort of belonging for the possibility of authentic selfhood. You too have stood at the edge of the known world and wondered what lies beyond.